We reaffirmed our 2% inflation target in January. We are very focused on trying to achieve our 2% inflation target, and it is not a subject of discussion.
The inflation data is just not firming as many Fed watchers have expected. Tim Quinlan, Wells Fargo. As the market anticipated, the Bank of Canada raised its benchmark overnight interest rate by 25 base points to 0.75% on Wednesday this week. In response, the loonie soared to levels not seen in nearly a year. How long do you think the Canadian dollar can maintain this strength?
Yeah, in our view, markets have kind of already partly reacted to the evolving Canadian policymakers' position in terms of where they're keeping short-term interest rates. Basically, since their shift in tone earlier in June, and with the Canadian dollar short positioning extended, the Canadian dollar has strengthened by, round numbers 3% or so versus the greenback during the month. And it extended that, obviously, in the wake of the actual announcement when it did come. It really just reinforces our longer-held view that the Canadian dollar will gradually strengthen a bit over time versus the U.S. dollar. I guess, broadly, the biggest driver of that, in our view, is the fact that the relative monetary policy stances of the two central banks are now beginning to converge, whereas for the last year or so you've had a Fed that's been tightening and a Bank of Canada that's been sitting on its hands. It seems as though they are now both kind of in, albeit very slow, but they're in a tightening frame of mind, and on that basis there's some scope for the Canadian dollar to gain a little bit versus the U.S. greenback.
And according to Fed Chair Janet Yellen, the U.S. economy is healthy enough for the Fed to raise rates and begin winding down its massive bond portfolio, though low inflation and a low neutral rate may leave the central bank with diminished leeway. Tim, what do you make of this? Yeah, well, this, in a way kind of ties to your earlier question with, in terms of the scope for the Canadian dollar to appreciate. To a large extent, it's going to be a function of what the Fed is doing. And, Fed speakers have recently been holding a position that the dip in inflation is probably transitory, the kind of a favored word of Fed policymakers. But Yellen, I would say, raised a little bit of a red flag on inflation, not only in her prepared remarks, but also during her testimony to Congress on Wednesday and Thursday of this week. One kind of notable comment she made, and this may not be a perfect quote, but it was something along the lines of, we're watching inflation very closely and stand ready to adjust our policy if it appears that the undershoot is consistent. Since that time, we had producer price inflation data yesterday come in a little soft. This morning in the United States, Friday morning, we just received June CPI numbers, and again, kind of soft here. The consensus was looking for a monthly increase of about 0.1% and a year-over-year gain of 1.7%, and then the actual outturn, there's no change on the month-over-month number, and the annualized rate or the year-over-year rate is now just 1.6%. So it's kind of another indication that the inflation data is just not firming as many Fed watchers have sort of expected. And the German Chancellor Angela Merkel closed the G20 summit with a rebuke to President Donald Trump's stance on climate change. Do you think this highlights the rift Trump's policies and rhetoric are creating? And how do you see EU-US relations continuing?
Well, yeah, I think it certainly highlights the rift. Trump's stance on climate policy is at odds with long-standing U.S. policy. We're members of the Kyoto Treaty, and currently there are more than 200 cities in the United States and 12 individual states that have announced their own plans to still support the Paris Agreement. It's kind of a head-scratcher, frankly. There's a lot of concern about this issue in the United States, but in the United States, there's a lot of support for the Paris Agreement. In fact, according to a Yale survey conducted earlier this year, 69% of Americans think that we ought to be in it. And so in the second half of your question, how do I see it impacting EU-U.S. relations? It's kind of tough to tell, but we got some indication of this just in the last few hours. The New York Times posted an op op-ed piece that was penned by Gary Cohn, the director of the National Economic Council here in the U.S., and it was co-authored by H.R. McMaster, who's now the National Security Advisor in the United States. And they had a kind of the key takeaway from that piece is that the United States cannot be a passive member of international organizations. And I think this is kind of speaking directly to the Paris Agreement and the timing of it coming during the G20 meeting, and I think kind of highlights their view that this administration doesn't want to be held to the expectations of the broader global community, and whether or not that's consistent with widely held U.S. values is not for me to comment on. But I don't think it's a positive for the near-term relations between the EU and the United States.
Thank you for joining us today, Tim, and providing your expert insight. So that's all for today's weekly wrap-up. We hope you have a lovely weekend and see you again on Monday for plenty more.